Most people think America was shaped by battles, by muskets, cannons, and famous last stands. But tonight, we're not talking about wars. We're talking about quiet choices, decisions made in candle-lit rooms, whispered compromises, and moments where nothing exploded, yet everything changed. These choices shaped America more than any battlefield ever could. So settle in, slow your breathing, and let's drift through the decisions that quietly built a nation. Before we begin, if calm history stories help you unwind or fall asleep, you're welcome to subscribe. New sleepy history videos are always waiting for you here. No rush, no pressure. Just history, told softly. In the summer of 1787, the United States existed in a fragile, uneasy pause between failure and possibility. The war for independence had been won, but the victory felt unfinished, like a story that had reached a dramatic climax only to falter before the ending could be written. The 13 states were technically united, but in practice they were drifting apart, each pulled by its own needs, fears, debts, and ambitions. The document meant to hold them together, the Articles of Confederation, was proving too weak to carry the weight of a nation trying to survive. Under the Articles, the central government was more suggestion than authority. Congress could request money from the states, but it could not compel them to pay. It could declare war, but it could not raise a reliable army. It could negotiate treaties, but it could not enforce them. There was no national executive to carry out laws, no national courts to interpret them, and no practical way to resolve disputes between states. Each state printed its own money, set its own trade rules, and guarded its sovereignty with suspicion. Cooperation depended almost entirely on goodwill, and goodwill was in short supply. The cracks were already visible. States argued over borders and tariffs. Farmers, crushed by debt and taxes, began to revolt, most famously in an uprising that sent a chill through the political class. Foreign powers watched carefully, unsure whether this new republic would endure or fracture into something smaller and easier to control. Inside taverns and town halls, ordinary people debated whether independence had been a mistake, whether life under a distant king had been simpler than life under a distant Congress that seemed unable to do much of anything at all. It was in this atmosphere that delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, their task was modest. They were authorized to revise the Articles of Confederation, to patch the holes and strengthen the structure just enough to keep it standing. No one had given them explicit permission to tear the whole thing down and build something new. In fact, many people assumed that was impossible. The Articles required unanimous consent from all 13 states to be changed. One dissenting state could block everything. The odds were stacked against meaningful reform from the start. And yet, almost from the moment the doors closed and the windows were shut against the summer heat, it became clear that revision would not be enough. The problems ran too deep. The structure itself was flawed. The nation was not suffering from a few loose boards or a leaky roof. Its foundation was unstable. To fix it properly would require courage, imagination, and a willingness to step beyond the narrow instructions they had been given. This was the first, and perhaps most important choice, to stop trying to repair what could not be repaired, and instead attempt something entirely new. It was a quiet decision, made without fanfare, but it changed everything. By choosing to write a new constitution rather than endlessly revise the old articles, the delegates placed the future of the country above strict obedience to precedent. They risked being accused of overreach, of betrayal, even of treason. But they also acknowledged a simple truth: a nation cannot survive on fear of change alone. The room itself reflected the tension of that choice. Delegates argued passionately, sometimes angrily, over nearly every detail. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states feared being swallowed and demanded equal representation. Northern states and southern states clashed over trade, slavery, and political power. Some delegates believed the people could be trusted with broad participation in government. Others feared what unchecked democracy might unleash. There was no consensus waiting to be discovered. It had to be built, slowly and painfully, through compromise. Compromise became the defining feature of the entire effort. It was not romantic, and it was rarely satisfying. Each agreement left someone disappointed, someone uneasy, someone worried about what they had given up. But compromise kept the process alive. Without it, the convention would have collapsed within weeks, and the states would have returned home angrier and more divided than before. One of the most significant compromises balanced the demands of large and small states by creating a two-part legislature. One chamber would reflect population, giving more populous states a stronger voice. The other would grant equal representation to every state, regardless of size. This decision did not declare a winner. It acknowledged that both sides had legitimate fears. It was an admission that unity sometimes requires complexity, and that fairness is not always found in simplicity. Another compromise addressed the nature of executive power. Many Americans associated strong executives with monarchy and tyranny. Others recognized that a government without an energetic executive could not function effectively. The solution was a single executive, restrained by term limits, checks from the legislature, and the possibility of removal from office. It was a careful balance, designed to be strong enough to act but limited enough to be held accountable. Even the idea of dividing power itself was a compromise. Instead of placing authority entirely in one branch, the new system distributed power among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Each could check the others. Each could block excesses. This was not done because the delegates trusted one another apply, but because they did not. The Constitution was built on an understanding of human nature that accepted ambition, rivalry, and self-interest as permanent features of politics. The solution was not to pretend these traits did not exist, but to design a system that forced them to counterbalance one another. All of this stood in stark contrast to the Articles of Confederation, which had relied on the states' willingness to cooperate voluntarily. That faith had proven misplaced. The Constitution replaced it with structure, authority, and enforceable law. It created a federal government that acted directly on individuals rather than through the states alone. This shift was subtle on paper but revolutionary in practice. It meant that the nation was no longer just a league of states, but a single political entity with real power. The choice to do this was not universally celebrated. Many feared that the new Constitution went too far, that it would erase state sovereignty and concentrate power in distant hands. Others worried that it did not go far enough, that it left unresolved tensions that would resurface later. These concerns were not irrational. They were the price of compromise. Every decision reflected a trade-off between competing values: liberty and order, unity and independence, stability and flexibility. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this moment was how close it came to failure. Delegates threatened to leave more than once. Votes were often narrow. The entire project depended on a shared belief that collapse was worse than concession. Had even a few key figures walked away, the convention might have dissolved, leaving behind nothing but bitterness and egret. The United States could have drifted into a loose confederation, fractured into regional alliances, or fallen prey to internal conflict long before it ever became a global power. Instead, the delegates chose to keep talking. They chose patience over pride. They chose imperfect agreement over ideological purity. And when they were finished, they presented the states not with a revised set of articles, but with an entirely new framework for government. It was shorter than many expected, deliberately flexible, and built to endure change. It did not promise perfection. It promised a process. Ratification was its own test. The Constitution did not take effect automatically. It had to be debated, defended, criticized, and approved. Supporters argued that it offered the only realistic path to survival. Critics warned of hidden dangers and demanded safeguards. The debate forced Americans to think deeply about what kind of nation they wanted to be, and how much power they were willing to grant in order to remain united. Out of that debate came another crucial compromise: the promise of amendments protecting individual rights. Without that promise, ratification might have failed. With it, the Constitution became not a fixed command, but a living document, capable of growth and correction. This flexibility was not an accident. It was another deliberate choice, born from the understanding that no generation can foresee every challenge the future will bring. Looking back, it is easy to see the Constitution as inevitable, as though the nation was always destined to arrive at this solution. But in 1787, nothing felt inevitable. The path forward was uncertain, the risks were enormous, and failure seemed entirely possible. The decision to abandon the Articles of Confederation was not a rejection of the past, but an acknowledgement of reality. The experiment had taught its lessons, and those lessons demanded change. This choice shaped America more profoundly than any single battle. Battles decide who holds territory, who claims victory, who survives a particular conflict. The decision to write a new constitution determined how power itself would be organized, restrained, and transferred for generations. It created a framework that allowed disagreements to be settled through law rather than force, through debate rather than rebellion. It did not prevent conflict, but it gave conflict a structure that made survival possible. The Constitution's endurance is not proof of perfection. It has been amended, challenged, and reinterpreted countless times. It has been used to justify both justice and injustice. But its existence reflects a foundational decision that when a system no longer serves its purpose, the answer is not always to cling to it out of fear, but to reimagine it with care. In choosing compromise over collapse, the nation's early leaders accepted uncertainty in exchange for possibility. They chose a future that required constant effort, constant negotiation, and constant vigilance. That choice did not guarantee success, but it made success imaginable. And in the quiet, sweltering summer when a failing framework was set aside and a new one was written, the United States took a step away from disintegration and toward endurance, a step that continues to shape the country long after the echoes of its earliest battles have faded. When the American Revolution ended, the most dangerous moment for the new nation did not arrive on a battlefield. It arrived quietly, in the space left behind when the fighting stopped. Armies had been disbanded, treaties signed, and a powerful empire defeated. But victory created a question that no musket or cannon could answer. Who would hold power now, and for how long? At the center of that question stood George Washington. He was the commander who had held the Continental Army together through hunger, cold, defeat, and doubt. Soldiers trusted him. Civilians admired him. Foreign governments respected him. There was no other figure in the young nation with comparable authority or prestige. If anyone could have claimed permanent power, it was him. And in that dangerous moment, many expected him to do exactly that. History offered countless examples of revolutions that ended with a new king wearing a different crown. Power, once seized, rarely let go of itself. Generals who liberated nations often decided that only they could truly protect what they had won. The logic was simple and seductive. If one man had guided the country through war, why shouldn't he guide it through peace as well? Stability, people argued, required continuity. Strength required a single steady hand. Washington knew this history well. He had read it. He had seen how fragile republics could collapse into dictatorships when fear outweighed restraint. And he understood something even more unsettling, that the people might accept a king if that king promised order. After years of chaos, hunger, and uncertainty, monarchy could look comforting. The danger was not that Washington would seize power against the will of the people. The danger was that they might offer it to him willingly. That possibility weighed heavily on him. Letters circulated suggesting he should become a monarch, or at least hold power for life. Officers who had not been paid whispered about force. Politicians feared instability more than authority. Washington could have justified staying. He could have argued that the nation wasn't ready yet, that his leadership was still necessary, that stepping aside would invite disorder. Many would have believed him. Instead, he chose something unprecedented. He chose to leave. When Washington resigned his military commission and later stepped away from the presidency, he did something far more radical than winning a war. He established the idea that power was not personal property. It was temporary, borrowed, held in trust, then returned. This choice was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but its impact echoed far beyond his lifetime. At the end of the war, when Washington stood before Congress to resign his command, the moment stunned observers. Kings did not give up armies. Victors did not step aside. And yet he did so without drama, framing his decision not as a sacrifice, but as a duty fulfilled. He was not relinquishing power because he was weak or unwanted. He was relinquishing it because the job was done. This act alone sent a signal to the world. The American experiment was not built around a single man, no matter how admired. It was built around an idea that leadership exists to serve, not to rule. That idea was fragile. It depended entirely on example, and Washington provided it at the moment it mattered most. Years later, when the new government was formed, N.D. Washington was chosen as the first president. The same temptation returned. The presidency itself was untested. No one knew how much power it would accumulate, or how easily it could be abused. Washington's presence reassured people. His restraint gave the office legitimacy. But his popularity also meant that he could have stayed indefinitely. There were no term limits written into law at the time. Nothing prevented him from serving again and again, as long as elections confirmed him. Many assumed he would. Some even hoped he would. A lifetime presidency, they argued, was different from a monarchy if it rested on public approval. But Washington saw the danger in that logic. Approval could be shaped, expectations could harden. What began as choice could become habit, and habit could become entitlement. So, after 2 terms, Washington stepped down. He did not do so in anger or exhaustion. He did it deliberately, understanding that his departure mattered as much as his leadership. By leaving willingly, he transformed the presidency from a personal achievement into a temporary responsibility. He taught the nation that no one, not even its most revered figure, was indispensable. This decision reshaped how Americans understood authority. It suggested that stability did not come from permanence, but from repetition, from the orderly transfer of power, from the knowledge that leadership would change without bloodshed. That expectation, once established, became one of the most powerful traditions in American political life. The significance of this choice cannot be measured in immediate outcomes. Nothing collapsed when Washington left office. Nothing dramatic happened at L. And that was precisely the point. The absence of crisis became the proof. Power passed calmly to another leader. The government continued. The nation endured. In that calm transition lay a quiet revolution. It demonstrated that legitimacy could survive beyond a single personality, that institutions, not individuals, could carry the weight of governance. This was not inevitable. It was taught, slowly, through example. Washington's refusal to cling to power also shaped how future leaders were judged. Ambition did not disappear, but it was reframed. Seeking office became acceptable, refusing to leave it became suspect. The idea that leaders should know when to step aside became part of the moral language of American politics, even when it was not always honored. It is easy, from a distance, to romanticize this choice, to imagine it as effortless, as though Washington simply preferred retirement to responsibility. But the reality was more complex. He understood the risks of departure. He worried about factionalism, about the strength of the institutions he was leaving behind. Stepping down required faith, not in himself, but in the system he had helped create. That faith was not blind. It was grounded in the belief that a nation could only mature if it learned to function without its founders. Clinging to leadership, however benevolent, delayed that maturity. Letting go forced the country to grow. By refusing to be king, Washington denied future leaders a powerful excuse. He removed the argument that extraordinary times require extraordinary permanence. He showed that even in uncertainty, restraint was possible. That choice did not eliminate the temptation of authoritarianism, but it made it harder to justify. Over time, this expectation of temporary power became one of the nation's most defining features. It allowed political conflict to remain largely procedural rather than existential. Losing an election did not mean losing everything, because power was understood to be reversible. This understanding lowered the stakes just enough to make disagreements survivable. The choice also influenced how Americans saw themselves. They were not subjects waiting to be ruled, but citizens participating in a system larger than any individual. Leadership was something that passed through hands, not something that rested in them forever. That idea encouraged vigilance. It reminded people that liberty depended not only on laws but on habits. Washington's decision did not solve every problem. The nation continued to struggle with inequality, injustice, and internal division. Power was not always transferred peacefully, and ideals were often betrayed. But the expectation he set remained a reference point, a standard against which actions could be measured. When later leaders faced the temptation to extend their authority, Washington's example loomed quietly in the background. It did not always prevent excess, but it complicated it. It forced those who sought permanence to explain themselves, to argue against a tradition that had been present since the beginning. In this way, Washington's greatest contribution may not have been his leadership during war, or his guidance in peace, but his willingness to become ordinary again, to return to private life, to demonstrate that the Republic did not need a hero forever, only a system strong enough to outlast them. This choice shaped America more deeply than many battles, because it defined how power itself would behave. Armies could win independence, but only restraint could preserve it. The refusal to become king was not a rejection of authority, but a redefinition of it. Authority would come with limits, with endings, with the understanding that it must always eventually be handed back. And so, in stepping away, Washington did something that echoes through centuries of governance. He proved that the most powerful act a leader can perform is sometimes not to rule, but to let go. When the Constitution was first written, it was meant to solve a dangerous problem: how to give a young nation enough power to survive without giving it so much power that it could become a threat to its own people. The document created structure, balance, and authority where chaos had reigned under the Articles of Confederation. But for many Americans, something essential was missing. The Constitution described what the government could do, how it would function, and how its powers would be divided. But it said very little about what the government could not do. That absence unsettled people. The revolution had not been fought merely to replace one distant ruler with another, or one powerful system with a new version of the same threat. It had been fought over lived experience, soldiers quartered in homes, speech punished, assemblies dissolved, warrants issued without cause, and justice bent by authority. These were not abstract fears. They were memories. And memories have a way of shaping expectations long after the danger has passed. As debates over ratification spread through towns, newspapers, and meeting halls, a deep anxiety surfaced. What would stop this new federal government from doing the same things the British Crown had done? What would prevent Congress from silencing critics, disarming citizens, or imprisoning people without trial? Supporters of the Constitution argued that the structure itself was protection enough. Power was divided. Checks and balances existed. No single branch could dominate the others. But many were not convinced. A system could work perfectly on paper and still fail in practice. Laws could be interpreted creatively. Emergencies could be used as excuses. Power, once granted, tended to expand into any space left undefined. To trust that the government would restrain itself felt naive to people who had lived under authority that promised restraint and delivered control. This tension nearly derailed the entire project. Several states made it clear that they would not support the Constitution without explicit protections for individual liberties. They did not want promises implied through structure. They wanted promises written in ink, not suggestions, not assumptions, boundaries. Out of this pressure came one of the most important choices in American history, the decision to add a Bill of Rights. This was not an obvious or universally supported move. Some of the Constitution's strongest defenders believed listing rights was unnecessary or even dangerous. If certain rights were written down, they worried, future governments might claim that unlisted rights did not exist. Silence could be interpreted as permission. Others believed that since the federal government was only granted specific powers, it had no authority to violate USHISTOry. It was never given the power to touch. But the demand for clarity outweighed these concerns. The people wanted a visible line, one the government could not cross without openly violating its founding promise. They wanted something more than trust. They wanted constraint. The Bill of Rights emerged from this insistence. It did not create rights from nothing. It acknowledged rights people believed they already had. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to be secure in one's home, the right to a fair trial. These were not gifts from the government. They were declarations of limits placed upon it. This distinction mattered deeply. The Bill of Rights did not say, "The government grants you these freedoms." It said, in effect, the government is forbidden from taking them. That reversal of power was intentional. Authority flowed upward from the people, not downward from the state. By writing these protections into the Constitution, Americans did something rare in the history of government. They treated power as something dangerous by default, not evil but risky, something that required constant supervision. The Bill of Rights assumed that even a government created with good intentions could become oppressive if left unchecked. This assumption shaped the tone of the entire document. The amendments are not poetic or flattering to authority. They are cautious, restrictive, at times openly distrustful. They anticipate abuse and attempt to block it before it can take root. They reflect a hard-earned lesson: liberty does not survive on optimism alone. Consider how unusual this was in its time. Most governments defined what subjects owed the state. The Bill of Rights defined what the state owed its people, or more accurately, what it was forbidden to demand. This inversion changed the relationship between citizen and government at its foundation. The First Amendment alone reshaped the public sphere. By protecting speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition, it carved out a space where dissent could exist without permission. Criticism was no longer treason by definition. Belief was no longer a matter of compliance. Ideas could circulate freely, even when they were uncomfortable or unpopular. This freedom was not granted because speech was harmless. It was granted because speech was powerful. Silencing it was easier than confronting it. The Bill of Rights chose confrontation over control. Other amendments protected the body itself: papers, persons. They recognized privacy not as a luxury, but as a defense against domination. To be secure from unreasonable searches was to be safe from arbitrary intrusion. To require warrants and due process was to force the government to justify itself before acting. The rights of the accused were especially revealing. They reflected an understanding that the state, with its resources and authority, held a natural advantage over individuals. Fair trials, legal counsel, impartial juries. These were tools meant to level an uneven field. They acknowledged that justice required friction, that efficiency was not the highest virtue when liberty was at stake. Even the amendment structure itself carried meaning. The Bill of Rights was placed at the front of the Constitution, not buried at the end. It was meant to be read first, to frame everything that followed. Before powers, there were prohibitions. Before authority, there were limits. Perhaps most importantly, the Bill of Rights was a promise made not only to the people living at the time, but to future generations. It assumed that power would change hands, that circumstances would evolve, that fear, anger, and crisis would test restraint, and it attempted to speak across time, reminding future leaders that some actions were forbidden, no matter how tempting or convenient they might seem. This promise was not self-enforcing. Words on paper cannot stop injustice on their own. The Bill of Rights has been ignored, violated, narrowed, and contested throughout American history. It did not prevent oppression, but it provided a language for resistance, a standard to appeal to, a reminder that abuse of power was not merely unfortunate but unconstitutional. That distinction mattered enormously. When rights are violated without a shared standard, resistance becomes rebellion. When rights are violated against a written promise, resistance becomes a demand for accountability. The Bill of Rights transformed grievances into claims grounded in law. It also shifted the burden of justification. Instead of citizens needing to prove why they deserved freedom, the government was forced to explain why it needed to restrict it. This reversal did not always protect the vulnerable in practice, but it changed the moral and legal framing of power. Every overreach required a defense. Over time, this framework influenced how Americans understood themselves. They were not merely governed, they were protected, not by the goodwill of leaders, but by enforceable limits. This understanding encouraged participation, criticism, and vigilance. It reminded people that liberty was not passive. It required attention. The Bill of Rights also acknowledged something uncomfortable, that fear was not always irrational. The people who demanded these protections were not paranoid. They were realistic. They understood that governments, even democratic ones, could become instruments of harm. The amendments did not insult the new government. They restrained it for its own good, and for the survival of the system itself. By agreeing to these limits, the government gained legitimacy. Trust was not demanded, it was earned. The act of binding itself reassured skeptics that the new system would not simply replace one form of domination with another. It was an act of humility, written into law. This choice shaped America more deeply than many wars, because it defined the tone of power itself. It declared that authority must justify its existence continuously, that it must operate within boundaries, that fear belonged on the side of government, not the people. The promise was simple but radical, that no matter who held office, no matter how strong the state became, there would always be lines it could not cross without betraying its foundation. Those lines would be debated, tested, and sometimes ignored, but they would exist. And because they existed, Americans could argue not just about policy, but about principle, not just about outcomes, but about rights. The Bill of Rights turned liberty into something visible, nameable, and defensible. In choosing to add it, the nation admitted something vital, that freedom is fragile and power is persistent, that good intentions are not enough, that the safest government is one that expects to be questioned. That promise, made in writing, did not guarantee justice, but it changed the direction of accountability. It told the government from the very beginning that its role was not to be feared as a master, but to fear becoming one. When the United States was being formed, few questions were as quietly dangerous as who would ultimately control the military. Armies win independence, but they can just as easily end it. History was filled with examples of republics that had fallen not to foreign enemies, but to their own generals, men who were celebrated as protectors and later feared as rulers. The founders understood this pattern well. Many of them had studied it. Some had lived close enough to power to see how quickly admiration could turn into obedience and how easily obedience could harden into force. The American Revolution itself had depended on military leadership. Without an army, independence would have been impossible. Without discipline, it would have failed. And yet, once the fighting ended, the presence of a standing army felt less like protection and more like a threat. Soldiers had not been paid consistently. Officers felt betrayed by politicians. Whispers of coups and marches on Congress circulated in tense moments. The fear was not imaginary. It was immediate. At the heart of this fear was a simple truth. Armed power, once separated from civilian authority, rarely returns quietly. A general who commands loyalty, controls weapons, and believes himself essential can justify almost anything in the name of stability. If order depends on force, then force becomes the ruler. Many nations had learned this lesson too late. So when the framers of the Constitution faced the question of military authority, they chose something deliberately counterintuitive. They placed ultimate command of the armed forces not in the hands of a career soldier, not in a council of generals, but in a civilian leader, someone elected, accountable, and removable. This was not done because civilians were expected to be better military strategists. It was done precisely because they were not. The distance between civilian leadership and military command was intentional. It created friction, delay, debate. All the things armies dislike, but republics need. By making the president a civilian, the commander-in-chief, the Constitution drew a firm line between force and authority. The military would execute decisions, not make them. Strategy would serve policy, not replace it. The gun would remain subordinate to the law. This choice reflected deep suspicion, not of soldiers themselves, but of unchecked power. The framers did not believe generals were inherently tyrannical. They believed that systems that allowed force to rule inevitably drifted toward tyranny, regardless of who held command. The danger was structural, not personal. Civilian control also ensured that the military remained connected to the society it defended. Generals would answer to leaders chosen by the people. Budgets would be set by legislators. Wars would require political justification, not just tactical opportunity. Violence would be a tool of last resort, not a first impulse. This separation mattered most in moments of crisis. When fear is high, the temptation to act quickly and decisively grows strong. Military solutions can feel comforting in their clarity. Civilian oversight slows that instinct. It forces questions. It requires explanation. It introduces doubt. These are not weaknesses in a democracy. They are safeguards. The decision also acknowledged that the military is uniquely capable of shaping outcomes through force. That power demanded restraint, not encouragement. By embedding the armed forces within a civilian framework, the Constitution treated them not as an independent pillar of authority, but as an instrument of collective will. This arrangement did not diminish the honor of military service. Instead, it elevated it by tying it to principle rather than ambition. Soldiers were not asked to swear loyalty to a commander who might outlast the law. They were asked to serve a constitution, mediated through civilian leadership. Their obedience was bounded. Their role was defined. Over time, this structure proved its worth not because it prevented every misuse of force, but because it prevented force from becoming the default answer to political disagreement. Disputes between states, parties, and leaders remained largely civilian matters. Elections replaced coups. Courts replaced purges. Even when violence occurred, it was framed as a failure of the system, not an accepted method of governance. The absence of military rule in American political life is not an accident of geography or luck. It is the result of a deliberate design choice made at the beginning, reinforced by habit and expectation. Generals did not become kings because the system never invited them to try. This choice also shaped the identity of the presidency itself. The president was powerful, but not martial by nature. The office carried authority without uniform, command without personal armies. Even presidents with military backgrounds were required to shed that identity upon taking office. They became civilians again, subject to law and limitation. Civilian control also reassured the public. Citizens did not need to fear that political disagreement would be met with tanks in the streets as a matter of course. The military was visible but not omnipresent, powerful but restrained. Its loyalty was institutional, not personal. There were moments when this balance was tested, times when military leaders disagreed with civilian decisions, times when wars were unpopular or strategies contested. In these moments, the system revealed its deeper purpose. The military could advise, protest internally, even resign, but it could not rule. Its authority ended where civilian decision-making began. This boundary protected both sides. It protected civilians from intimidation, and it protected the military from being politicized beyond its role. When soldiers become rulers, they inherit blame for everything that follows. By remaining subordinate, the military preserved its professionalism and legitimacy. The choice to place the military under civilian control also sent a signal to the world. It suggested that strength did not require domination, that security did not depend on perpetual readiness to rule by force. It offered a model, imperfect but influential, of how armed power could exist within democratic limits. This model was fragile. It depended on shared belief, on leaders willing to respect boundaries even when they could be tempted to cross them, on generals willing to accept restraint even when they believed they knew better. It was sustained not just by law but by culture. That culture was shaped early. From the moment George Washington resigned his commission and returned power to civilian hands, the message was clear. The army existed to serve the republic, not to define it. Later generations absorbed this lesson not through speeches, but through repetition. Power changed hands peacefully. The military stayed in its lane. This did not mean the military was weak. It meant it was disciplined in a deeper sense. Its strength lay not only in force, but in submission to authority that did not carry weapons. This inversion, armed power obeying unarmed leadership, was rare, and it mattered. The alternative was always visible. In other nations, generals stepped into political vacuums, promising order, efficiency, and protection. Often, they delivered silence instead. The American system chose disorder over domination, debate over decree, delay over decisiveness when decisiveness threatened liberty. By choosing a civilian commander-in-chief, the nation acknowledged a hard truth that the greatest threat to a free society often comes from within, wearing the uniform of necessity. The decision was a preemptive defense, not against invasion but against itself. This choice did not eliminate the risk of abuse, but it narrowed the path. It made it harder for force to masquerade as legitimacy. It required power to pass through civilian hands before it could be exercised violently. That requirement slowed momentum and invited scrutiny. In this way, the choice shaped the character of American governance. Power would be loud in debate, not in boots. Authority would be argued, not imposed. The presence of the military would remain constant, but its role would remain constrained. The true success of this decision lies in how unremarkable it has become. Civilian control of the military feels natural, expected, unquestioned. That expectation is itself the legacy. When something so powerful becomes ordinary, it has done its work. Keeping the military under civilian control did not guarantee peace. It did not prevent war, but it prevented the transformation of force into rule. It kept the gun behind the desk, not seated in the chair, and in doing so, it preserved a fragile promise that in America power would ultimately answer not to those who could seize it, but to those who were trusted temporarily to hold it. In the early years of the United States, the nation was small, not only in size but in confidence. It stretched along the eastern edge of a vast continent it did not control and barely understood. Beyond its western borders lay rivers, forests, plains, and unknown peoples, all claimed by distant empires with interests that did not always align with America's fragile independence. The future of the country was uncertain not because it lacked ambition, but because it lacked room, security, and leverage. One decision made quietly and controversially would change that reality more than any battle ever could. At the center of this uncertainty was the Mississippi River. For the young republic, the river was not just water flowing southward, it was an economic lifeline. Farmers in western territories depended on it to ship crops to market. Towns rose and fell based on access to its banks. Control of the Mississippi meant control of survival for large portions of the population. Yet the United States did not control it. Foreign powers did. Initially, Spain held the vast Louisiana territory, including New Orleans, the critical port at the river's mouth. Later, control shifted to France under Napoleon Bonaparte, a development that sent a quiet wave of fear through American leadership. France was not a declining empire managing distant lands half-heartedly. It was aggressive, ambitious, and led by a man who understood the value of territory and force. A powerful European nation controlling America's western access was a strategic nightmare. The United States was not in a position to confront France militarily. Its army was small, its navy was limited, its finances were fragile. War would have been catastrophic. Yet doing nothing was equally dangerous. If France chose to restrict access to New Orleans, the economic consequences could tear the country apart from within. Western settlers had already begun to question their loyalty to a government that seemed unable to protect their interests. President Thomas Jefferson faced an impossible dilemma. He believed deeply in limited government and strict interpretation of the Constitution. He distrusted centralized power and feared entanglements with European empires. And yet, the situation demanded action. The future of the nation depended on land it did not own, controlled by a power it could not fight. Jefferson's initial goal was modest. He instructed his diplomats to try to purchase New Orleans, or at least secure permanent access to the port. This alone would stabilize the Western economy and reduce the risk of conflict. The idea of acquiring the entire Louisiana territory, an area that would double the nation's size, was not part of the original plan. It seemed unrealistic, even absurd. But history has a way of opening doors unexpectedly. France, for all its power, was facing problems of its own. A slave revolt in the Caribbean had turned into a brutal, prolonged conflict. Disease ravaged French troops. War in Europe demanded attention and resources. Napoleon needed money more than land he could not easily defend. The vast Louisiana territory, instead of being a strategic asset, had become a liability. So when American envoys arrived, They were met not with resistance, but with an offer that stunned them. France was willing to sell all of Louisiana, not just the city, not just the river, everything. The scale of the offer was difficult to grasp. The territory stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to modern-day Canada. It contained resources, farmland, waterways, and possibilities beyond imagination. It would instantly transform the United States from a coastal republic into a continental power. And it would be done with a pen. There was no battle, no invasion, no declaration of war, just negotiation, calculation, and a signature on parchment. For $15 million, a sum that seemed enormous at the time but small in hindsight, the United States acquired land that would define its future. The simplicity of the act concealed its audacity. Jefferson himself was deeply conflicted. The Constitution did not explicitly grant the president the power to acquire foreign territory. Jefferson worried that the purchase might be unconstitutional. He even considered proposing an amendment to justify it. But time was short. Napoleon could change his mind. Another power could step in. Delay risked losing everything. So Jefferson made a choice that revealed a different kind of leadership. He set aside theoretical purity in favor of practical survival. He accepted that the Constitution was meant to serve the nation, not paralyze it. The decision weighed heavily on him, but he understood what was at stake. The future was larger than doctrine. The Louisiana Purchase reshaped the nation overnight. Borders expanded, possibilities multiplied. The fear of being hemmed in by foreign empires faded. The Mississippi River became American-controlled from source to sea. Western expansion accelerated, bringing opportunity, conflict, prosperity, and tragedy in equal measure. But what makes the purchase so remarkable is not just what it accomplished, but how it was accomplished. Throughout history, land has been taken by force. Empires rise by conquest, not contracts. Territory is seized through bloodshed, occupation, and domination. The Louisiana Purchase defied this pattern. It demonstrated that power could be exercised through diplomacy rather than destruction, that a nation could grow through negotiation rather than invasion. This did not mean the expansion was bloodless in its consequences. Indigenous nations would be displaced. Slavery would spread into new territories. Conflicts would follow settlers westward. The purchase opened doors that led to profound moral and political struggles. But the act itself, the transfer of land between nations, avoided the immediate devastation of war. That mattered. It set a precedent. The United States learned that its greatest strength did not always lie in military might, but in strategic patience, in recognizing opportunity, in knowing when to sign rather than strike. This lesson would echo throughout its history. The purchase also altered how Americans saw themselves. No longer confined to the Atlantic edge, the nation began to imagine a destiny that spanned the continent. Rivers, plains, and mountains became part of the national story. The sense of possibility expanded along with the borders. At the same time, the decision forced Americans to confront difficult questions. What would this land become? Who would control it? Would new states be free or enslaved? Would expansion strengthen unity or deepen division? The Louisiana Purchase did not answer these questions. It made them unavoidable. Politically, the purchase tested the limits of power. Jefferson's critics accused him of hypocrisy, of abandoning his principles when it suited him. Supporters argued that flexibility was not betrayal, but wisdom. The debate itself revealed a maturing democracy, one capable of questioning authority even in moments of triumph. Internationally, the purchase signaled that the United States was no longer merely reacting to events, it was shaping them. European powers took notice. The balance of influence in North America shifted decisively. Without firing a shot, the United States had altered the geopolitical map. The quiet nature of the decision is what makes it so easy to overlook. There were no victory parades, no fallen heroes to memorialize, no dramatic last stand to retell, just ink drying on paper. And yet, the consequences were permanent. The Louisiana Purchase ensured that the United States would not be easily threatened from the West. It reduced the likelihood of future wars with European powers over North American territory. It provided the space necessary for population growth, economic development, and innovation. It allowed the nation to absorb waves of immigrants and ideas. It also revealed a willingness to act boldly without violence. In a world that often equated strength with force, this was a subtle but powerful statement. The United States demonstrated that expansion did not always require conquest, that sometimes restraint could achieve more than aggression. The purchase also highlighted the importance of timing. Had negotiations occurred earlier or later, the outcome might have been different. Napoleon's needs aligned, briefly, with America's fears. Leaders recognized the moment and seized it. History often turns on such intersections, where hesitation or impatience can change everything. Looking back, it is tempting to view the Louisiana Purchase as inevitable, as though the land was always destined to become American. But inevitability is an illusion created by hindsight. At the time, the decision was risky, controversial, and uncertain. It could have failed politically. It could have triggered war. It could have fractured the young nation. Instead, it held. The choice to expand through a penstroke rather than a battlefield reshaped not only the map, but the character of American power. It showed that influence could be exercised quietly, that foresight could outperform force, that the most enduring victories are sometimes the ones no one hears. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase stands as a reminder that history is not only written by generals and soldiers, but by negotiators and decision-makers willing to act without applause. It doubled the nation's size without firing a single shot, and in doing so, it proved that the future could be claimed not just through strength, but through restraint, timing, and the courage to sign instead of strike. In the election of 1800, the United States came closer to breaking than it ever had in peacetime. The nation was barely 2 decades old, its constitution still untested, its institutions fragile, its unity uncertain. What was at stake was not merely who would hold office, but whether the system itself could endure the stress of disagreement. For the first time, political power was about to pass between rival groups who fundamentally distrusted one another. No one knew if the experiment would survive the moment when one side lost and the other won. The political climate was tense and deeply personal. Federalists and Democratic Republicans did not see each other as loyal opponents with different ideas. They saw each other as existential threats. Federalists believed their rivals would unleash mob rule, destroy property, and invite foreign chaos. Democratic Republicans believed the Federalists were building a disguised monarchy, cozying up to elites and foreign powers while strangling liberty. Each side believed the other would end the republic if allowed to govern unchecked. This fear was not abstract. Newspapers were vicious. Accusations of treason, atheism, corruption, and tyranny were common. The language of politics was already sharp enough to cut trust to pieces. Many Americans quietly wondered whether elections were too dangerous for a nation still learning how to govern itself. John Adams, the sitting president, represented continuity, order, and strong central authority. Thomas Jefferson, his former ally and now rival, represented decentralization, skepticism of concentrated power, and faith in the people. Their philosophies clashed not only in policy, but in temperament. Adams believed stability required firmness. Jefferson believed liberty required restraint of authority. Each believed the other's vision would undo what the Revolution had achieved. When the votes were counted, the result was a shock. The incumbent president had lost. Even more alarming, the election ended in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, throwing the decision into the House of Representatives. For weeks, uncertainty reigned. Rumors spread. Tempers flared. Armed conflict was not unthinkable. Some spoke openly of resistance, others of manipulation, still others of force. This was the moment when many republics in history had collapsed. A disputed election, deep factional hatred, an armed population, a weak tradition of peaceful succession. These ingredients had ended countless democratic experiments before they could mature. The question was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. Would the United States follow the same path, or would it do something unprecedented? Behind closed doors, Federalists debated extreme options. Some considered delaying the transition. Others hoped to extract concessions. There was fear that Jefferson would dismantle the government, purge institutions, or align the country with revolutionary France. Jefferson's supporters, meanwhile, feared that Federalists would refuse to relinquish power at all. Each side suspected the worst intentions in the other, and yet, when the crisis passed, when the House finally resolved the tie and Jefferson was declared the winner, something remarkable happened. Nothing exploded. There were no troops in the streets, no arrests of political enemies, no rival governments declared. John Adams did not challenge the outcome. He did not claim fraud. He did not attempt to hold onto office by force or manipulation. He prepared to leave. On the morning of Jefferson's inauguration, Adams quietly departed the Capitol. There was no ceremony marking his exit, no dramatic farewell. He simply stepped aside. Authority passed to his rival without violence, without coercion, without collapse. This act, simple on the surface, carried extraordinary weight. For the first time in modern history, a national government had changed hands peacefully through an election between opposing factions, not between allies, not within a ruling class that shared the same interests, but between groups who genuinely feared one another. The transfer of power was not merely procedural, it was a test of faith, and it passed. Jefferson understood the significance immediately. In his inaugural address, he struck a tone designed to soothe rather than triumph. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. Instead, he spoke words meant to lower the temperature of the moment. "We are all Republicans," he said. "We are all Federalists." It was not entirely true, but it was necessary. The message was clear. Disagreement would not mean destruction. This peaceful transfer did more than preserve stability in the short term. It established a precedent that would shape American political culture for centuries. It taught citizens and leaders alike that losing an election did not mean losing the republic, that opposition could survive defeat, that power was not something to be clutched desperately, but something to be handed over when the people decided. This lesson was not written into the Constitution. It was not enforced by law. It was created through behavior, through restraint, through the willingness of individuals to accept outcomes they disliked in order to preserve a system they believed in. That distinction matters. Laws can compel compliance, but they cannot manufacture legitimacy. Legitimacy emerges when people choose to honor outcomes even when doing so costs them power. John Adams lost the presidency, his influence, and his political standing. But in stepping aside, he secured something far larger: the credibility of the American experiment. The alternative was easy to imagine. Had Adams refused to leave, had Federalists attempted to cling to power, the young nation could have fractured immediately. States might have chosen sides. Violence could have followed. The Constitution might have been dismissed as a failure before it had a chance to become tradition. Instead, the calm transfer of authority turned democracy from an idea into a practice. It proved that elections were not invitations to chaos. They were mechanisms for continuity through change. This moment also reshaped how Americans understood opposition. Political rivals were no longer automatically enemies of the state. They were competitors within a shared framework. That framework allowed for intense disagreement without requiring elimination. It created space for dissent to exist without becoming rebellion. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Once people saw that power could change hands peacefully, the fear surrounding elections diminished, never entirely, but enough to make participation possible. Citizens could vote knowing that losing did not mean catastrophe. Leaders could govern knowing they would one day leave. This expectation became self-reinforcing. Each peaceful transition made the next one easier. Each concession strengthened the norm. Over time, the idea that leaders would simply refuse to step aside became increasingly unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it violated a deeply ingrained habit. The transfer of power in 1801 also subtly redefined strength. Strength was no longer measured only by control, but by restraint, by the ability to accept loss without resorting to force. In this sense, Adams demonstrated a form of leadership as consequential as any policy decision he made in office. Jefferson, too, played a role. He could have used his victory to punish opponents, dismantle institutions, or entrench his faction permanently. He did not. He governed with an awareness that legitimacy depended on inclusion, not dominance. That choice reinforced the lesson that victory carried responsibility, not entitlement. The survival of democracy in that moment was not guaranteed by numbers or laws. It was preserved by behavior, by the decision of individuals to prioritize the system over themselves. That is why this choice shaped America more than many battles. Battles decide who controls territory. This decision determined whether power itself could be contested without violence. Over time, the memory of 1801 faded into routine. Peaceful transfers became expected, ordinary, almost boring. And that boredom was a triumph. It meant the system was working so well that its most miraculous moments felt unremarkable. But history shows how fragile that norm always was. Around the world, elections have repeatedly triggered violence, coups, and collapse. The American example stood out not because its people were uniquely virtuous, but because its leaders, at a critical moment, chose restraint over fear. The transfer of power in 1801 taught the nation that democracy was not about always winning. It was about always continuing. That continuity required humility from winners and dignity from losers. It required faith that today's defeat could become tomorrow's victory without tearing everything apart. This lesson shaped institutions, expectations, and political identity. It allowed parties to form, dissolve, and reform without threatening the survival of the state. It made disagreements survivable. It turned conflict into a process rather than a crisis. When rivals handed over authority calmly, democracy proved it could survive disagreement, not because disagreement disappeared, but because it was contained within a shared commitment to procedure. That commitment, born in quiet moments rather than dramatic ones, became one of the most powerful forces in American history. The transfer of power in 1801 did not end division, it did not create harmony. But it answered the most important question a republic can face: what happens when we lose? The answer, in that moment, was simple and revolutionary. We continue. When the Civil War began, the question of slavery hovered over the nation like a storm cloud that everyone could see but few could agree on how to confront. It was the cause beneath the conflict, the wound that had never healed, yet it was not immediately declared the purpose of the war itself. For Abraham Lincoln, the newly elected president, this tension was not a contradiction, but a reality he had to navigate carefully. His deepest moral convictions told him slavery was wrong. His political and constitutional responsibilities told him that ending it outright, immediately, might destroy the very nation he was sworn to preserve. This was the space Lincoln occupied from the moment he took office, a place where morality, law, timing, and survival collided. Lincoln hated slavery. He said so repeatedly, clearly, and publicly. He believed it was a moral evil, incompatible with the ideals on which the nation claimed to stand. Yet he also believed, just as firmly, that the president did not possess unlimited power. The Constitution protected slavery where it already existed. Several slaveholding states remained loyal to the Union, and their support was fragile. If they left, the war could be lost before it was fully fought. This reality forced Lincoln into a position that frustrated abolitionists and confused later generations. He did not rush to issue an emancipation decree. He did not immediately transform the war into a moral crusade against slavery. Instead, he spoke carefully. He acted cautiously. He waited. To many, this waiting felt like betrayal. Enslaved people were suffering every day. Soldiers were dying. Why hesitate? Why not strike at the institution that lay at the heart of the conflict? But Lincoln understood something crucial. A proclamation issued at the wrong moment, without sufficient legal or political grounding, could be reversed as easily as it was declared. A moral statement, no matter how righteous, could vanish with the next election or the next court ruling. Lincoln wanted something stronger than symbolism. He wanted permanence. At the start of the war, his primary stated goal was to preserve the Union. This was not because slavery mattered less to him, but because without a Union, there would be no mechanism left to destroy slavery at all. If the nation fractured permanently, slavery could expand unchecked in the Confederacy and beyond. Preservation was not avoidance, it was strategy. The early months of the war were uncertain and chaotic. The Union Army suffered defeats. Public confidence wavered. Foreign governments watched closely, weighing whether to recognize the Confederacy. In this environment, a sudden emancipation proclamation could have backfired disastrously. It might have driven border states into secession. It might have united white Southerners more firmly around the Confederate cause. It might have been dismissed, internationally, as desperation rather than principle. Lincoln also understood the legal vulnerability of executive action. As president, his authority to free enslaved people did not exist in peacetime law. But wartime created a narrow opening. As commander-in-chief, he could take actions justified as military necessity. That justification mattered. Without it, emancipation could be challenged as unconstitutional overreach. So Lincoln waited, not passively, but deliberately. As the war dragged on, conditions began to shift. Enslaved people fled to Union lines in increasing numbers, forcing the federal government to confront slavery in practice, not just theory. Congress passed laws undermining the institution, banning slavery in federal territories, ending it in Washington, D.C., and refusing to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. Step by step, the ground moved. Public opinion, too, began to change. The cost of the war mounted. Casualties rose. Many in the North began to see slavery not just as a moral wrong, but as a strategic liability. It sustained the Confederate economy and freed white men to fight. Ending it could weaken the enemy. Lincoln watched all of this closely. Privately, he drafted an Emancipation Proclamation months before he announced it. He was ready, but he was waiting for the right moment. He believed that timing would determine whether emancipation would be accepted as a legitimate act of leadership or rejected as a reckless gamble. That moment came after a hard-fought battle that the Union could plausibly frame as a victory. Only then did Lincoln move forward. When he announced the proclamation, he did so not as a sudden moral awakening, but as the next logical step in a war that had already transformed the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation was limited. It did not free all enslaved people. It applied only to states in rebellion, not to loyal slaveholding states. This limitation disappointed many, but its power lay not in its completeness, but in its direction. For the first time, the federal government declared slavery incompatible with the Union's war effort. Freedom became an official objective. That shift changed everything. The war was no longer only about restoring the old Union. It was about redefining it. Enslaved people were no longer merely victims on the margins of conflict. They became central to its outcome. Many joined the Union Army. Their labor, intelligence, and courage strengthened the cause of their own liberation. Internationally, emancipation altered perceptions. European powers, where slavery had been abolished, found it politically impossible to support a confederacy now openly fighting to preserve human bondage. What had once looked like a regional conflict now appeared as a struggle over fundamental human values, yet Lincoln was not finished. He knew the proclamation alone was not enough. It was a wartime measure, tied to military authority. Its legality after the war could be questioned. Courts might overturn it. A future president might ignore it. Slavery could re-emerge through loopholes and resistance. So Lincoln turned his attention to something even more enduring, a constitutional amendment. This was the culmination of his patience. The amendment would abolish slavery everywhere, permanently, without reliance on wartime powers. It would require broad support. It would require persuading lawmakers, navigating political deals, and enduring fierce opposition. It was slow, difficult work, but it was the only way to make freedom irreversible. By the time the amendment passed, the nation had changed. Soldiers had fought and died in a war explicitly linked to emancipate. Enslaved people had seized their own freedom in countless acts of courage. Public opinion had been reshaped by sacrifice. What once seemed radical now felt necessary. Lincoln did not live to see the long-term results of this transformation, but his approach left a lasting mark on American governance. He demonstrated that moral urgency does not always require immediate action, that sometimes delay is not weakness, but discipline. Waiting did not mean indifference. It meant preparation. It meant aligning law, public will, and military reality so that when action came, it could endure. Lincoln understood that freedom declared too early might be lost, while freedom secured at the right moment could become permanent. This approach has often been misunderstood. It is tempting to judge Lincoln by what he did not do sooner, but doing so misses the larger achievement. He did not merely announce the end of slavery. He anchored it in the nation's legal foundation. He transformed a moral conviction into a constitutional fact. That transformation mattered because moral statements can fade. They can be ignored, reversed, or reinterpreted. Legal realities are harder to erase. They shape institutions, expectations, and future debates. Lincoln's patience ensured that emancipation would survive not just the war, but the generations that followed. His decision also revealed a deeper understanding of leadership. He knew that a president is not only a moral voice, but a steward of institutions. Acting at the wrong time could satisfy conscience while undermining results. Acting at the right time could change history. The delay was painful. It came at a terrible human cost. That trut. H cannot be softened. But within the constraints of his role and the realities of his moment, Lincoln chose a path that maximized the chance of lasting change rather than symbolic victory. In the end, emancipation was not a single act, but a process, one that required patience, courage, and relentless focus. Lincoln's restraint did not weaken the cause of freedom, it strengthened it. By waiting for the moment when law, power, and purpose aligned, he ensured that freedom would not be a promise easily broken, but a reality written into the nation itself. Waiting for the right moment turned a moral statement into a lasting legal reality. When the Civil War ended, the United States faced a problem larger than rebuilding cities or reintegrating states. The deeper question was more unsettling. What exactly did freedom mean now, and who exactly did the nation belong to? The war had destroyed slavery as an institution, but it had not yet answered what would replace it. Emancipation freed millions of people from bondage, but freedom without definition could be hollow, temporary, or easily stolen back. The future of the country depended not just on ending slavery, but on deciding who counted as a full member of the American political community. This question did not announce itself with cannons or marching armies. It unfolded quietly, in legal language, committee rooms, and constitutional text. The answers came not through speeches alone, but through amendments, carefully worded, fiercely debated, and deceptively calm. Together, the Reconstruction Amendments rewrote the meaning of citizenship, and in doing so, reshaped who America was supposed to belong to. Before the war, citizenship in the United States was deliberately vague and deeply exclusionary. The Constitution, as originally written, avoided defining it clearly. In practice, citizenship was shaped by race, gender, property, and local custom. Enslaved people were not citizens. Free Black Americans were often treated as outsiders, denied rights, and excluded from political participation. Even their legal existence depended largely on the state they lived in. This ambiguity was not accidental. It allowed the nation to claim universal ideals while practicing selective inclusion. The war shattered that arrangement. Once slavery was abolished, the question could no longer be avoided. If formerly enslaved people were free, were they citizens? If they were citizens, what rights did that citizenship guarantee? And if the federal government did not define those answers, who would? The first response from many southern states made the danger immediately clear. In the aftermath of the war, new laws were passed that restricted the movement, labor, and autonomy of Black Americans. These laws did not call themselves slavery, but they functioned as something disturbingly close to it. Freedom existed in name, but not in reality. The old hierarchy was attempting to reassert itself under a new disguise. Northern lawmakers watched this unfold with alarm. The war had been fought at enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands had died. To allow freedom to be hollowed out so quickly felt like a betrayal of that sacrifice. But outrage alone was not enough. What was needed was authority, clear, enforceable, and national. The Reconstruction Amendments were the answer. The first of these amendments did more than abolish slavery. It removed the legal foundation on which bondage rested everywhere in the country without exception. This mattered because it shifted freedom from policy to principle. Slavery was no longer something states could argue over. It was forbidden, permanently. But abolition alone did not create belonging. It ended one form of exclusion without addressing the larger structure that had allowed it to exist. Freedom without citizenship left people vulnerable to new forms of control. The next step was more radical and far more controversial. The Second Amendment of Reconstruction tackled citizenship directly. For the first time, the Constitution defined who was a citizen of the United States. Birthright citizenship was established clearly and unequivocally. If you were born in the country, you belonged to it. This single sentence quietly overturned centuries of racial and legal exclusion. This was a profound shift. Citizenship was no longer a privilege filtered through race or granted at the discretion of states. It became a national identity, grounded in existence rather than approval. You did not have to earn it through property or lineage. You did not need permission. You simply were. That definition carried enormous consequences. If formerly enslaved people were citizens, then the government owed them protection. Not charity, not tolerance, protection. Citizenship created obligations. It meant that states could no longer decide on their own who deserved rights and who did not. The amendment went further. It promised equal protection under the law and due process. These phrases were intentionally broad. They were not designed to solve every problem immediately. They were designed to establish a standard, a baseline that future generations could interpret, argue over, and enforce. This was both the strength and the vulnerability of the amendment. Its language allowed it to endure, but it also allowed it to be resisted. Equality, after all, can be acknowledged in theory while denied in practice, and due process can be stretched, delayed, or selectively applied. Still, the amendment marked a turning point. For the first time, the federal government claimed the authority to intervene when states violated the rights of their own citizens. This was a dramatic departure from the past. The balance of power shifted. The federal government became a guarantor of individual rights, not merely a referee between states. This shift was not welcomed by everyone. Many argued that it violated the principle of state sovereignty. Others warned that it would lead to federal overreach. Some simply opposed the idea of racial equality altogether. and cloaked that opposition in legal language. The debate was fierce, but the amendment passed. The Third Reconstruction Amendment addressed political power directly. It declared that voting rights could not be denied on the basis of race. This was not just about ballots. It was about voice, about participation, about whether citizenship had meaning beyond paper. Granting voting rights to black men, because women of all races were still excluded, was revolutionary. It threatened existing power structures and unsettled those who had long governed without challenge. The amendment attempted to translate legal equality into political reality. Together, these amendments created a new framework for American identity. They did not simply add rights, they redefined the relationship between the individual and the nation. Citizenship became national, not conditional. Rights became enforceable, not aspirational. Belonging became a constitutional promise. And yet, the quietness of this transformation made it easy to underestimate. There were no grand ceremonies marking the redefinition of citizenship. No single moment when the nation paused to absorb what had changed. The amendments entered the Constitution quietly, their language technical, their implications vast. Many Americans did not fully grasp what had been set in motion. Resistance came swiftly. States found ways around the amendments. Laws were crafted to appear neutral while producing unequal outcomes. Violence and intimidation suppressed participation. Courts interpreted protections narrowly. Over time, much of the promise of Reconstruction was undermined. This failure has often been used to dismiss the amendments themselves as ineffective, but that interpretation misses something crucial. The amendments did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were resisted. And the fact that resistance was necessary is evidence of how powerful they were. Even when ignored, the amendments remained. They did not disappear when enforcement waned. They stayed in the Constitution, waiting. Their language endured through decades of injustice, providing a foundation that later generations could return to. When movements for civil rights emerged long after Reconstruction had ended, they did not invent new principles from scratch. They reached back to these amendments. They argued that the promises had never been ill-filled, not that they had never been made. This distinction mattered. It transformed protest into legal claim, demands into enforcement. The Reconstruction Amendments reshaped the nation not by instantly creating equality, but by redefining legitimacy. They established that exclusion was not merely cruel, but unconstitutional. That inequality was not just unfortunate, but unlawful. This redefinition altered the moral center of American governance. The question shifted from who deserves rights to why are these rights being denied. The burden moved. Justification was now required for exclusion, not inclusion. The amendments also reframed American history itself. They forced the nation to confront the contradiction between its founding ideals and its practices. They did not resolve that contradiction, but they embedded its resolution into the legal structure of the country. By doing so, they expanded the meaning of "we the people." Those words, once narrow and exclusionary, became aspirational in a new way. They pointed toward a broader community, one not yet fully realized, but constitutionally envisioned. This vision was incomplete. Women remained excluded from political participation. Indigenous peoples were still denied full recognition. Inequality persisted across lines of race, class, and geography. But the direction had changed. The framework now allowed expansion rather than contraction. Quietly, The Reconstruction Amendments transformed the Constitution from a document that tolerated exclusion into one that condemned it. They did not eliminate injustice, but they made it harder to defend. They created a legal vocabulary for equality that could outlast the era that produced it. This is why their impact extends far beyond Reconstruction itself. They reshaped debates about immigration, voting rights, education, policing, and representation. They influenced court decisions and social movements. They turned citizenship into something more than a status. It became a claim. The amendments also revealed something sobering about democracy. Rights written into law do not enforce themselves. They require vigilance, courage, and willingness to confront power. The failure of Reconstruction was not a failure of principle, but of sustained commitment. Yet even in that failure, the amendments endured. Their presence meant that injustice was never normalized completely. It always existed in tension with a higher standard. That tension became a source of pressure, change, and eventual reform. Quietly redefining citizenship reshaped who America was supposed to belong to, not by finishing the work of equality, but by making it unavoidable. The Reconstruction Amendments declared that the nation could no longer define itself narrowly, without contradicting its own constitution. They asked a question that continues to echo: if citizenship is universal, what does justice require? And if the law promises belonging, how long can exclusion survive? The answers have been contested ever since, but the promise remains, written, preserved, and waiting to be fully honored. When the Second World War ended, Europe lay broken in ways that went far beyond ruined cities and shattered bridges. Entire economies had collapsed. Food was scarce. Industries were silent. Millions were displaced, homeless, or hungry. Governments struggled to function. The physical destruction was obvious, but the deeper damage was psychological and political. Trust had eroded. Institutions had failed. Desperation filled the vacuum where stability should have been. For the United States, the moment carried a familiar temptation. History offered a well-worn path: punish the defeated, extract reparations, weaken former enemies so they could never rise again. This approach felt emotionally satisfying. The war had been brutal, the losses immense. The instinct to demand payment for suffering was understandable. Many voices, both domestic and international, argued that Germany and its allies deserved hardship, not help. But beneath that instinct lay a dangerous truth. Punishment had been tried before. After the First World War, harsh reparations and economic isolation had helped destabilize Europe, fueling resentment, extremism, and collapse. The consequences were still visible in the rubble of the Second War. Another cycle of vengeance risked planting the seeds of yet another catastrophe. The United States faced a choice that would shape the post-war world. It could treat victory as an endpoint, or it could treat it as a responsibility. It could define itself as a conqueror or as something new. The Marshall Plan emerged from this crossroads. At its core, the plan was simple in concept and radical in execution. Instead of punishing former enemies, the United States would help rebuild them. Instead of extracting wealth, it would inject it. Instead of exploiting weakness, it would try to eliminate it. This was not charity, it was strategy grounded in an understanding of history, economics, and human behavior. The logic was straightforward but profound. ND. Desperate societies are unstable societies. Hunger breeds anger, unemployment breeds extremism, broken economies invite authoritarian solutions. If Europe remained poor and fractured, it would not remain peaceful. And in the emerging global order, instability anywhere could become a threat everywhere. There was also the looming presence of a new rival. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war powerful, suspicious, and eager to expand its influence. Economic misery in Western Europe created fertile ground for radical ideologies. Communism promised order, equality, and relief from suffering. Without viable alternatives, many might accept it, not out of conviction, but necessity. Rebuilding Europe was therefore not just an act of generosity. It was an investment in stability, a way to prevent desperation from turning into dominance by force or ideology. The United States recognized that power in the modern world would not be measured solely by armies, but by the ability to shape recovery. Yet this perspective was far from universal. Many Americans questioned why they should spend billions helping countries that had recently been enemies. The war had drained resources. Soldiers were returning home. Infrastructure needed rebuilding domestically. Why should American taxpayers fund foreign recovery? These objections were not trivial. They reflected genuine concern about priorities and fairness. Helping former enemies required a reframing of justice itself, not as punishment, but as prevention. That reframing was the most difficult part. Choosing the Marshall Plan meant rejecting a simple moral narrative in which victory entitled the victor to dominance. It required action, alleging that lasting peace depended not on humiliation, but on dignity. That enemies defeated militarily still needed a future, that rebuilding others could ultimately protect oneself. The plan also broke with tradition in how it was structured. Aid was not simply handed out. European nations were encouraged to cooperate, plan collectively, and rebuild interconnected economies. This cooperation fostered trust and integration, laying the groundwork for long-term political and economic alignment. The effect was transformative. Factories restarted, food supplies stabilized, currencies strengthened, infrastructure returned to life. Confidence grew. The sense that the future could be better than the past began to re-emerge. But perhaps more important than the material results was the psychological shift. Former enemies were no longer treated solely as defeated states under supervision. They were treated as partners in reconstruction. This restored agency mattered. It allowed nations to rebuild pride without reviving militarism. For Germany in particular, the choice was pivotal. A country that had twice been crushed and punished now experienced a different outcome. Recovery replaced resentment. Integration replaced isolation. Democracy had a chance to take root in soil that was no longer poisoned by despair. This approach also reshaped how the world understood American power. The United States was no longer just a nation that could win wars. It was a nation willing to shoulder responsibility after them. It demonstrated that strength could be used to stabilize rather than dominate. That distinction mattered enormously in the emerging international order. Alliances formed, not simply out of fear, but out of trust. Countries aligned with the United States not only because of military protection, but because of economic partnership. Influence flowed from reliability, not coercion. The Marshall Plan also sent a clear message about the nature of victory itself. Victory was not complete when the enemy surrendered. It was complete only when the conditions that led to war were addressed. This expanded definition of success reoriented global leadership around prevention rather than reaction. Of course, the plan was not purely altruistic. American industries benefited from European recovery. Markets reopened. Trade flourished. Economic interdependence grew. But this mutual benefit was part of the design, not a flaw. Prosperity was shared, not extracted. This mutuality distinguished rebuilding from occupation. Instead of dependency, the plan aimed at self-sufficiency. Instead of control, it aimed at partnership. The goal was not to rule Europe, but to ensure it did not collapse again. Choosing rebuilding over punishment also set a moral precedent. It suggested that enemies could become allies without erasing the past, that accountability did not require permanent suffering, that justice could include restoration. This idea ran counter to centuries of international practice. Empires rose by weakening rivals. Peace treaties imposed loss. Borders were redrawn to humiliate. The Marshall Plan offered a different model, one in which stability came from strength shared, not strength denied. The success of this approach reshaped global expectations. It influenced the creation of international institutions designed to manage conflict through cooperation, rather than conquest. It reinforced the idea that economic health was inseparable from political stability. The plan also quietly redefined American identity. The United States had emerged from the war with unmatched power. What it chose to do with that power would define its role for generations. By rebuilding former enemies, it chose stewardship over supremacy. This choice did not eliminate conflict. It did not create a peaceful world overnight, but it changed the trajectory. Western Europe recovered rapidly. Democratic institutions strengthened. The appeal of extremist ideologies diminished. A foundation was laid for decades of relative stability. Equally important was what did not happen. There was no widespread collapse into authoritarianism in Western Europe. No resurgence of militant nationalism fueled by economic misery. No immediate repeat of global war. These absences are easy to overlook, but they are the quiet victories of prevention. The Marshall Plan also demonstrated something subtle about leadership. It showed that confidence allows generosity. Only a nation secure in its strength can afford to help former enemies without fear. In this way, rebuilding became a display of power more persuasive than punishment ever could be. The decision also influenced how Americans understood their role in the world. Isolationism had once seemed safe. The war proved otherwise. The Marshall Plan acknowledged that disengagement could be as dangerous as domination. Stability required involvement, not as an empire, but as a partner. This approach would later be tested, challenged, and sometimes abandoned. Not every intervention lived up to the same principles, but the example remained. It stood as proof that global leadership did not have to be defined by force alone. Choosing the Marshall Plan over punishment reshaped the post-war world by changing the meaning of victory. It turned enemies into stakeholders, ruins into foundations, fear into cooperation. Most importantly, it defined America not just as a nation that could win wars, but as one that understood what came after. A global stabilizer, not merely a victor. In a century scarred by destruction, that choice offered a different kind of strength. The strength to rebuild, to trust, and to imagine peace as something that must be constructed deliberately, not merely hoped for once the fighting stops. From the beginning, the United States spoke the language of popular rule while practicing it selectively. The idea that government derived its power from the consent of the governed was treated as a foundational truth, yet the definition of who counted as the governed was narrow, fragile, and fiercely guarded. Voting was not imagined as a universal right. but as a privilege extended cautiously, often reluctantly, to those deemed worthy. The story of American democracy, then, is not a straight line toward inclusion, but a slow, uneven expansion, one that reveals how ideals can exist long before a nation is ready to live up to them. In the early republic, voting was largely reserved for white men who owned property. This restriction reflected deeply held assumptions about independence, responsibility, and trust. Property ownership was believed to anchor judgment. Those without it were seen as too dependent, too easily influenced, too unstable to wield political power responsibly. Democracy, in this view, required limits to protect itself from excess. These limits were defended as practical safeguards, not moral exclusions. But they embedded inequality into the political system from the start. Large portions of the population, women, enslaved people, free black Americans, indigenous peoples, the poor, were governed without voice. The nation claimed to represent the people, while defining that category narrowly and inconsistently. Over time, these contradictions became harder to ignore. As the country grew, so did the gap between its ideals and its practices. The pressure to close that gap did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each expansion of voting rights shaped by conflict, fear, and resistance. Each step forward was contested. None were inevitable. The first major shift came with the removal of property requirements for white men. As the nation expanded westward, old assumptions about land status and political competence began to weaken. Frontier life demanded participation, not hierarchy. The idea that a man could fight wars, pay taxes, and build communities yet lack a political voice became increasingly difficult to justify. Expanding voting rights to all white men was framed as democratization, and it was. But it was also exclusionary in new ways. By broadening participation for one group, the nation reinforced boundaries around others. Race became more firmly entrenched as a dividing line. Inclusion for some hardened exclusion for others. Still, this expansion mattered. It transformed the political culture. Campaigns shifted. Parties organized around mass participation. The expectation that ordinary citizens should have a voice took root. Democracy became louder, messier, and more visible. The Civil War forced a more profound reckoning. Slavery had denied not just voting rights but humanity itself. Its abolition raised unavoidable questions about political belonging. Freedom without voice was a fragile promise. Citizenship without participation was incomplete. The extension of voting rights to black men after the WR represented one of the most radical expansions in American history. For a brief period, democracy became something closer to its stated ideals. Black voters participated in elections, held office, and shaped laws. The political system reflected a broader reality, but this expansion was met with fierce resistance. Violence, intimidation, and legal maneuvering were used to suppress black political power. Over time, barriers multiplied: poll taxes, literacy tests, arbitrary rules, and outright terror. The right to vote existed in law but not in practice for millions. This reversal exposed a painful truth: expanding rights on paper does not guarantee their protection in reality. Each expansion required not only legal change, but sustained enforcement and cultural acceptance. Without those, progress could be rolled back quietly and effectively. The struggle for voting rights did not stop. It shifted. Women, long excluded from political participation despite their central role in society, organized and demanded recognition. Their arguments echoed the nation's founding language: representation, consent, equality, but were met with familiar resistance. Politics, critics claimed, was too harsh, too corrupt, too unsuitable for women. When women finally gained the right to vote, it did not immediately transform political outcomes, but it transformed legitimacy. Democracy became less defensible as a system that excluded half the population. The meaning of the people expanded again, reshaping expectations about representation and voice. Even then, inclusion was incomplete. Indigenous peoples were often denied voting rights despite being subject to federal authority. Immigrants faced shifting restrictions. Language, residency, and citizenship requirements became tools of control. Each generation inherited a system that claimed progress while leaving gaps. The mid-20th century brought another reckoning. The civil rights movement exposed the distance between democratic ideals and lived reality with clarity that could no longer be dismissed. Images of citizens denied ballots, beaten for attempting to vote, or silenced through fear made the contradiction undeniable. The expansion of voting rights during this period did not create something new. It attempted to fulfill promises already made. The language of equality, protection, and participation had long existed. What changed was the willingness to enforce it. These reforms mattered not only because they increased participation, but because they reasserted a principle: that democracy requires constant maintenance. Rights once expanded can still be threatened. Progress is not permanent. Inclusion must be defended repeatedly. Throughout American history, each expansion of voting rights has followed a similar pattern. A group excluded from power asserts its claim. The nation resists. Arguments are made about readiness, danger, and tradition. Eventually, the contradiction becomes too obvious to sustain. The boundary shifts. Democracy widens. This pattern reveals something essential about the American experiment. The nation's ideals were aspirational from the beginning. They describe what America wanted to be, not what it already was. Voting rights expansions did not betray the founding vision, they tested it. Each expansion pulled the country slightly closer to its own words, not all at once, not evenly, often imperfectly, but consistently in one direction. The resistance to these expansions also reveals a recurring fear that widening participation will destabilize the system, that new voices will disrupt order, that power, once shared, will be lost. These fears have accompanied every major change, and yet each time participation expanded, democracy endured. This endurance did not come from uniformity, but from adaptability. The system survived because it could absorb new participants, new perspectives, and new demands. Inclusion did not weaken democracy, it forced it to grow. Expanding voting rights also reshaped political responsibility. When more people could vote, more people could be held accountable. Power dispersed. Representation became more complex. Governance required negotiation rather than assumption. The process was slow by design and by resistance. Sudden inclusion often triggered backlash. Gradual change allowed institutions to adjust, norms to evolve, and legitimacy to build. This slowness was painful for those excluded, but it also prevented collapse. Still, gradualism has limits. Delay often meant suffering. The tension between patience and justice has defined every expansion. History shows that progress often required pressure, organizing, protest, and persistence to overcome inertia and fear. What unites all these moments is not inevitability but choice. At each stage, the nation could have refused. It could have defended exclusion indefinitely. That it did not, fully or consistently, is the result of countless decisions made by individuals and movements insisting that democracy live up to itself. Expanding voting rights did not erase inequality. It did not guarantee justice. But it changed the structure through which injustice could be challenged. Voice created leverage. Participation created visibility. Voting transformed grievance into influence. This is why voting rights expansions matter more than many dramatic events. They reshape who gets to decide the future. They determine whose concerns count. They define the boundaries of belonging. Each expansion also left a legacy. Once a group gained the vote, removing it became more difficult. Expectations hardened, norms shifted. The idea that exclusion was acceptable weakened. Democracy learned, slowly, to recognize itself in a broader mirror. The story is unfinished. Debates over access, fairness, and representation continue. New barriers emerge even as old ones fall. The tension between inclusion and control persists, but the pattern remains. Each expansion pulls the nation closer to its ideals, not by perfect alignment, but by narrowing the gap. One group at a time, one struggle at a time, one decision after another. This slow, contested expansion is not a flaw in the American story. It is the story. A democracy learning, imperfectly and often painfully, how to include those it governs. Expanding voting rights, again and again, did not create a perfect system. It created a living one capable of self correction, one that understands, at least in principle, that legitimacy grows not from exclusion, but from participation. And in that ongoing process, the nation continues to be shaped, not by a single dramatic moment, but by the cumulative weight of decisions that widen the circle and bring practice a little closer to promise. Battles make noise, but choices echo. And as you rest tonight, remember, history is often shaped not by the loudest moments, but by the calm decisions made when no one was watching. Sleep well.